The woman was on the roof when he rode up. That was the first thing Cole Draven noticed, not the peeling paint on the barn, not the collapsed section of fence along the eastern pasture. Not the two small children sitting in the dirt below watching her with the patient, solemn faces of children who had learned not to fuss. He noticed her first, because she was the kind of thing a man noticed whether he meant to or not. She had a hammer in one hand and a fistful of cedar shingles in the other, and she was working the slope of that roof like the sun itself owed her something. The July heat pressed down on the Texas hill country like a hand trying to flatten the whole world, and the sky was the pale, washed-out white of bone that had been bleaching since April. Nothing moved in that heat except her. Cole pulled his horse to a stop at the gate post and sat there a moment, his saddle creaking. She didn't look down right away. She finished nailing the shingle she was holding, 3 clean strikes, no wasted motion. Then she turned and looked at him with eyes the color of creek water after a long rain, gray-green and serious and carrying something in them that hadn't settled yet. "You Draven," she called down. "Yes, Emmett said you'd be coming." She set the hammer on the ridge and climbed down the side ladder with a steadiness that told him she'd done it 100 times. When she reached the ground, she wiped her palm on her work skirt and held it out. "Clara Holt." He shook it. Her grip was dry and firm. "Your husband," he started. "Gone 6 months." She said it the way a person says the well went dry or the frost came early. A fact. A hard one, but just a fact. "I'm managing." He looked at the roof, the fence, the sagging barn door, the 2 children in the dirt. "I can see that," he said, and he meant it without any edge. Something shifted in her face, not softness exactly, but the slight easing of a woman who'd been braced for condescension and hadn't found it. "Emmett said you needed a place, and I need the work done," she said. "Bunkhouse is out back. Supper's at 6. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. Cole Draven had been riding for 11 days when he found the Holt place. Not riding toward anything in particular, that was the honest truth of it. He'd left the McAllister outfit in Abilene after McAllister's son had taken over the operation and decided that any man who wouldn't look the other way during a branding dispute wasn't worth his salt. Cole had taken his wages and his principal and his horse and headed south with no destination firmer than somewhere quieter. Emmett Pruitt had found him in a roadhouse outside of Fredericksburg, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold and watching the rain fall through a window that needed reglazing. "You looking for work or just looking sorry?" Emmett had asked, settling across from him without invitation. "Work," Cole said. Emmett told him about Clara Holt. Told him her husband Thomas had died of a fever in January, left her with 2 children, a boy of 8 named Will and a girl of 5 named May, 140 acres of good enough land. A house that was losing its fight with time, and neighbors who were more interested in her difficulty than in helping with it. Emmett said she was a proud woman and a private one, and that any man who went out there thinking she needed saving would be sent back the way he came. Cole had listened and said nothing for a long moment. Then he'd said, "How's the bunkhouse?" Emmett had laughed. "Roof leaks." "I can fix a roof," Cole said. He could. He demonstrated that within 4 hours of arriving, climbing up there with materials he'd found stacked and waiting in the barn. Organized with a neatness that told him Clara Holt had been planning that repair for a while and simply hadn't the hands for it. He'd taken over where she left off, and she'd gone inside without ceremony. The bunkhouse was worse than Emmett had described. The cot listed badly to one side, there was a wasp nest in the corner that required immediate negotiation, and the single window had a crack in it stuffed with a strip of old flour sack. Cole dealt with each problem in order, methodically, without complaint. He was used to worse. He'd slept in ravines. He'd slept in the open during a blue norther with nothing but his saddle blanket. The bunkhouse, leaning slightly as it was, felt almost luxurious. At 5 minutes to 6, he washed his face and hands at the pump, dried them on his kerchief, and walked to the back door of the main house. He knocked. "It's open," she called. The kitchen was warm with wood smoke and the smell of something that made his stomach clench with hunger in a way that was almost painful. He stepped inside and stood near the door, reading the room the way a man reads a new territory, careful, taking stock. The kitchen was clean but tired. The table had been scrubbed so many times the wood had gone pale. One chair had a leg that had been reset with a wedge of scrap wood. The curtains over the window were faded to the color of old grass but hung straight and even, pressed with care. Every surface held some evidence of effort sustained against considerable odds. Clara stood at the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of beans that had been cooking long enough to fill the whole room with their depth, bay leaf and salt pork and something smoky underneath. Beside it, a Dutch oven sat with a lid on it from which rose a smell of cornbread that hit Cole somewhere behind his ribs. Will sat at the table doing sums on a slate, his tongue pressed between his teeth. He was a thin boy with his mother's serious eyes and his father's jaw, from what Cole could tell from the single daguerreotype hung beside the parlor door. May sat on the braided rug near the hearth, arranging a collection of smooth creek stones into patterns that seemed to carry tremendous importance. Neither child paid him much mind, which he found reassuring. Children who'd been through grief either clung to strangers or regarded them with the quiet suspicion of old men. Will gave him one long evaluating look and returned to his sums. May didn't look up at all. "You can sit," Clara said without turning. "Will, move your school work." Will moved it without argument, sliding the slate to the edge and making room. Cole pulled out the chair across from him and sat, placing his hat on his knee, and waited. She brought the food to the table with the efficiency of a woman who had no time for ceremony, the pot of beans set on an iron trivet, the cornbread turned out onto a board. A small dish of butter that she'd clearly been saving because there wasn't much of it, a pitcher of cold water. She settled May into her chair, tucked a cloth into her collar against protest, and then sat herself and folded her hands and said grace in a quiet, private voice that wasn't performing anything for anyone. They ate. Cole helped himself carefully, taking less than he wanted the first pass, the way he'd been taught. The beans were good, better than good. She'd seasoned them with a patience that showed. The cornbread had a crust that gave way to a soft, dense interior and he ate 2 pieces before he caught himself and stopped. "It's good," he said. "The cornbread?" "I add a little sorghum," she said. "Makes the difference." She looked at him briefly, weighing whether this was flattery. Apparently deciding it wasn't, she nodded and passed him the butter. Will said, "Are you going to fix the fence next?" "Will," Clara said. "It's a fair question," Cole said. "Yes. The eastern section first, from what I could see. Then the gate post on the south pasture wants resetting. Will considered this. There's also a board missing in the chicken coop." "Will." Clara's voice was flat. "I'll find the board," Cole said. He said it to Will, but he was aware of Clara hearing it. Aware of the slight change in the quality of her silence. May, without looking up from her plate, said, "Our papa used to fix things." The table went very quiet. Clara set her fork down and then picked it up again. She said, "Eat your beans, May." "He did though," May said, untroubled. "He fixed everything." "He did," Clara agreed softly. "He did." Cole said nothing. He looked at his plate and gave the moment its full weight and did not try to fill it with anything, because some silences were not meant to be filled. After a moment the sound of forks resumed, and the fire in the stove popped once, and somewhere outside a nightbird started up its long, questioning call. When supper was done, Cole rose and carried his plate and cup to the basin without being asked. Clara watched him do it. He put on his hat and said good night to the children, who both said good night back, Will formally, May with a sudden shy smile that came and went like a struck match. He walked back to the bunkhouse in the blue-black dark and lay on the listing cot and listened to the Texas night make its 1,000 small sounds. And he thought that there was something about that kitchen, about the straightness of those faded curtains, about the care in those well-seasoned beans. That was the saddest and most determined thing he'd encountered in a long time. He was asleep before the thought finished forming. The first week passed in work. Cole rose before the sun and started on the fence, working section by section with a methodical focus that was partly his nature and partly a decision, a kind of respect for the property. For the work Thomas Holt had done before him and that the land still held in its memory. He reset posts, stretched wire, replaced rotted rails with cedar. He split himself from a downed log he found at the edge of the tree line. His hands blistered, healed, and toughened again. Will started appearing around mid-morning. The first day, the boy stood 20 feet off and watched. The second day, he came closer. By the third day he was handing Cole tools without being asked, developing an instinct for what came next that Cole found quietly impressive. "Your father teach you this?" Cole asked him one morning. "Some," Will said. "He showed me how to read the grain when you're splitting. Said fighting the wood just ruins your back and wastes your time. Smart man." Will was quiet for a moment, working a nail loose from an old rail. He was. Cole let that stand. He just went on working, and Will went on helping, and the fence rose back up in steady increments along the eastern line. May was a different study. She didn't come to the work sites. She presided over the yard the way a small empress presides over her territory, and she watched Cole's comings and goings with an unreadable gravity. Then, on the fourth day, she left a creek stone on the step of the bunkhouse. Just one, the flattest and smoothest of her collection, the pale grey colour of still water. He left it on the windowsill where he could see it. The fifth day she left too. By the end of the second week, she had begun following him at a distance of approximately 10 yards wherever he worked, occasionally providing unsolicited commentary on the quality of his efforts. "That board's crooked," she told him while he was repairing the chicken coop. He looked at it. She was right. He pulled it and reset it. "Better," she pronounced, and walked away. Clara saw all of this. Cole knew she saw it because she was a woman who missed nothing, even when she appeared to be entirely occupied with her own considerable work, the laundry she hauled and hung and hauled back. The kitchen garden she tended in the early mornings before the heat made it miserable, the mending she did by lamplight each evening. The account book she studied at the kitchen table with a pencil and an expression like a woman navigating a field she knows has been seeded with something bad. She didn't speak much. Not unfriendly, just contained. She handed him a mended work shirt one evening without comment, having noticed the tear at the shoulder without being told. She saved the heel of the bread for him each morning, setting it on the bunkhouse step with the coffee she'd taken to leaving out. He noticed these things the same way she noticed his, cataloguing them carefully, not making too much of them and not making too little. One evening near the end of the second week, she came out to the porch while he was sitting on the bunkhouse step in the cooling air. And she sat in the porch chair and they were quiet together for a little while, which felt like a kind of conversation. "You're good with them," she said finally. "They're good children. They miss their father badly." "I know. I don't want them confused about what you are," she said carefully. "You're a hired hand. A good one. But that's the shape of this." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not trying to be anything but useful." She looked at him for a moment with those creek-water eyes. Then she nodded and went back inside, and he sat in the dark and breathed the night air that smelled of cedar and dry grass and something faint and sweet he'd never been able to name. And he thought that Clara Holt was the most careful person he had ever met, and that the carefulness was not coldness but armor, and that there was a difference that mattered. 40 miles north, in the town of Carrow Wells, a man named Dent Holt had been hearing things. Dent was Thomas Holt's younger brother, and the family resemblance stopped at the bone structure because Thomas had been a decent and steady man and Dent was neither. He had Thomas's square jaw and Thomas's dark hair and none of Thomas's character, and he had been quietly furious since January at the reading of Thomas's will, which had left the 140 acres to Clara outright and to their children after her, with no mention of Dent whatsoever. He was sitting in Roe Callahan's saloon in Carrow Wells when word reached him, carried by a drummer passing through from the hill country, that Clara Holt had taken on a hired man. A stranger. A man who was living on the property and eating at the table and working the land. Dent sat with this information for a while, turning his glass. "What's the man's name?" he asked. The drummer didn't know. Where'd he come from? The drummer didn't know that either. Dent set some coins on the bar and walked out into the brutal afternoon. He stood in the street with the sun hammering down on the crown of his hat, and he thought about 140 acres of good enough land. And about how a widow woman alone might be convinced to make decisions that benefited her brother-in-law, and about how a stranger in the picture complicated that considerably. He thought about this for a long time. Then he went to find a man named Lowell Price, who was good at finding things out and not particular about how he did it. It was a Saturday when Clara took the wagon into Silas Creek for supplies, and she brought both children and, after a moment's practical consideration, coal. The road into town was 8 miles of hard-packed caliche that turned to dust behind the wheels and coated everything in a fine white powder. May sat in the wagon bed making the creek stones talk to each other in low, private voices. Will sat up front beside Cole, who was driving, and pointed out landmarks with a proprietorial pride. "That's where the creek bends, that's the old deering place, nobody lives there now. That hill is called a Wheeler's Shoulder, but nobody knows why." Cole listened and asked questions, and Will answered them with the expanding confidence of a boy who was being taken seriously. Clara sat beside Cole on the bench and looked at the road ahead and said nothing, but her shoulder was an inch from his and she didn't move it away. Silas Creek was a town in that fragile, provisional way of West Texas towns, alive today because the water held and the people were stubborn, with no guarantee of tomorrow. It had a dry goods store, a feed merchant, a bank that looked more substantial than it was, a church whose steeple had been struck by lightning and not yet fully repaired, and a scattering of wood-fronted businesses along a main street that the wind crossed without ceremony. People looked. Cole had expected that. A strange man driving a widow woman's wagon into town, it was exactly the kind of thing that small towns metabolized as gossip, and he bore the looks without expression. Helping Clara down from the wagon, settling the children, tying the horse. It was in the dry goods store that it happened. The woman's name, Clara told him quietly beforehand, was Harriet Goss, wife of the town's most important banker, self-appointed steward of Silas Creek's moral ledger. She was standing at the counter when they came in, and she turned with the precise, practiced speed of a woman who had been waiting. "Clara Holt," she said, in a voice like a door shutting on a cold day. "Harriet," Clara said evenly. She moved to the bolts of cloth and began examining what she needed. Harriet's eyes found Cole and settled there with the finality of a judge. "This the man you've taken on," she said. Not to Cole. To Clara. As though Cole were a piece of questionable merchandise. "Cole Draven," Clara said. "He's doing the repair work on the property." Harriet set down the ribbon she'd been holding. "Living out there, is he?" "On the property." "Bunkhouse," Clara said. "All the same." Harriet's voice went soft in a particular way that was not softness at all. "People do talk, Clara. You being alone out there. A man of unknown provenance living on the premises. The children." She let the word children do considerable work. Clara turned from the cloth bolts and looked at Harriet Goss with the calm, level expression of a woman who had carried something heavier than this woman's opinion for a long time. "The children have a roof over their heads," Clara said. "The fence is repaired. The barn is sound. And I have more work done on that property in the past 3 weeks than in the 6 months before it." She paused. "Is there something specific you're concerned about, Harriet? Something you'd like to say plainly?" Harriet opened her mouth. "Because if it's the arrangement's propriety," Clara continued, her voice steady and low, "I'd welcome your thoughts on how a widow woman alone with 2 children and 140 acres is meant to manage without hands. I'd genuinely welcome them. Do you have a practical suggestion, or only the social concern?" The dry goods store had gone very quiet. The clerk was studying the ceiling with great interest. Harriet's mouth closed. It opened again. "I only mean, I know what you mean," Clara said. "I've always known what you mean, Harriet." She turned back to the cloth. 2 yards of this, please, she said to the clerk, as though nothing had occurred. Cole had been standing near the door through all of this. He had not moved, had not spoken. He understood instinctively that this was Clara's ground to hold, that the worst thing he could do was step in front of her. But as Harriet Goss swept past him toward the exit, he touched the brim of his hat and said, pleasantly, And the pleasantness of it was its own kind of statement, a refusal to be shamed by association with a woman who had nothing to be ashamed of. Harriet left without another word. Outside, 20 minutes later, while Clara was at the feed merchant, Cole sat on the wagon seat and became aware of a man leaning against the post outside the barber shop across the street. Just leaning. Watching the wagon. Watching Cole. He was a compact man with a trimmed beard and the particular stillness of a man who'd learned stillness as a professional skill. He held Cole's gaze for 2 seconds, then looked away and spat into the dust and pushed off the post and walked down the street. Cole watched him go. He said nothing to Clara when she returned. But he remembered the face with the accuracy of a man who had learned that remembered faces sometimes saved your life. Later, coming out of the general store with May holding his hand because she decided to in the uncomplicated way of 5-year-olds, a man stopped him, an older man, weathered and direct, who introduced himself as Amos Grier, owner of the livery. "You the man working the Holt place?" Grier said. "That's right." "Good land," Grier said. He worked his jaw for a moment. "Thomas was a good man. Clara's a good woman. That land oughtn't go to waste for lack of hands." He looked at Cole steadily. "You plan on staying?" It was a direct question and deserved a direct answer. "Long as I'm needed," Cole said. Amos Grier nodded slowly, like a man filing something for future reference. "That's a good enough answer," he said, and walked on. May looked up at Cole. "I'm thirsty," she announced. He bought her a penny's worth of lemon drops from the jar on the store counter, and she held them in her fist like small treasures. And on the ride home she fell asleep against Clara's arm with her mouth slightly open and her fist still closed. Clara looked down at her daughter sleeping against her, and then looked at the road ahead, and said nothing. But something in the set of her shoulders had changed, something that had been braced had, for this moment, rested. The man Cole had seen outside the barber shop came to the Holt property on a Tuesday, 13 days after the trip into town. He came in the small hours, which told Cole something specific about his character and his intentions. Men with legitimate business come in the daylight. Men who come in the dark are calculating that darkness will cover something. Cole had developed the habit of light sleeping since arriving. Not anxiety, more a recalibration, an old instinct that the quiet seriousness of his responsibilities had woken back up. He slept aware, the way a good stockman sleeps aware, some part of him always reading the sounds of the night. The horse stopped him. Clara kept 2 horses, one Cole had named Temperamental on account of his opinions about everything. Temperamental did not tolerate strangers in his space without comment. And the comment he made at 2 in the morning was a single sharp snort followed by the sound of hooves shifting in the dry dirt of the corral. Cole was dressed and out the bunkhouse door in less time than it took to consider whether he was being careful enough. He moved in the dark without a lantern because a lantern would tell the man he was coming, and the moon was behind cloud cover which was about as much good fortune as he could have asked for. He circled wide around the barn, keeping the big shadow of the structure between himself and the corral, moving heel to toe on the dry grass with practiced quiet. He came around the north corner of the barn and stopped. The man was at the far end of the property, near the fence line where the eastern pasture met the tree line. He had a lantern shielded to a low glow and he was moving it slowly along the fence, not looking for a way in. Looking at the repair work. Looking at the posts, the wire, the quality of what had been done. Mapping the property. Cole levered around into the Winchester he carried, and the sound of it in the night silence was the clearest language there was. The man went very still. "Set the lantern down," Cole said. He kept his voice low. Not a shout, there were children sleeping in the house and he didn't intend to change that. "Slow." The man crouched and set the lantern in the grass, which told Cole he wasn't going for a weapon yet. Which told Cole he was a man accustomed to situations like this and calculating odds rather than running on instinct. "Stand up," Cole said. "Hands where I can account for them." The man straightened. His hands were at shoulder height. He turned slowly, and Cole could see his face in the lantern's low glow, the same compact man, the same professional stillness. "Price," Cole said, because he'd made inquiries after Silas Creek. Something shifted in Price's expression. Surprise, briefly. Then a kind of reassessment. "You know me," Price said. It wasn't a question. "I know what you are," Cole said. "Who sent you out here is my question." Price said nothing. Men like Price rarely answered that question, which was itself an answer. "Dent Holt," Cole said. Still nothing from Price. But his jaw moved slightly, tightening. "This is private property," Cole said. "The widow's land, deeded and registered in the county records. You're standing on it in the middle of the night with a shielded lantern, which tells me you weren't planning on knocking." He paused. "I'm going to give you one clear choice. You walk back to whatever you rode in on, and you carry a message back to whoever sent you, and the message is this: this property is maintained, watched, and defended. That's all. Nothing complicated. You understand me?" Price looked at him for a long moment with the measuring eyes of his profession. "And if I don't feel like carrying a message," he said. "Then we'll settle this right here," Cole said. "And I'll carry the message to the county sheriff in the morning, because I'm a living man and you'll be evidence." He said it without heat, without drama. The way a man states a fact about weather or distance. Price reached down slowly and picked up his lantern. "No trouble tonight," he said. "That's the right answer," Cole said. He walked Price to the property line with the Winchester at a considered angle, and watched him mount and ride north into the dark, and stood there until the sound of the horse was gone entirely. The night around him was enormous and still, full of cricket song and the smell of dry grass and the distant complaint of a coyote working the ridge. He turned and found Clara standing on the porch. She had a shotgun. A good one, double-barreled and held with the comfortable authority of a woman who had used one before. She was wearing a long work dress over her nightclothes and her hair was loose, and she looked, in the pale dark, like something serious and unyielding that had always been there. He walked to the porch and stood below it, looking up at her. "You heard," he said. "I've been a light sleeper since January," she said. He nodded. He understood that completely. "Who was it?" she said. "A man named Price. He works for Dent." Her face went very still in the way that is not calm but the surface over something beneath. She looked at the dark line of the tree line where Price had vanished. "He wants the land," she said. It wasn't surprise. "He wants you to feel alone enough to deal," Cole said. She looked down at him. The moon had come out from behind its cloud cover, and the light was the silver-grey color of old iron, and in it she looked both very tired and absolutely decided. "He won't get it," she said. "No," Cole said. "He won't." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that crosses a distance and closes it. "Cole," she said. And stopped. "I know," he said. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat on the bunkhouse step with the Winchester across his knees and the Texas dark wrapped around him like something that could be managed. And he thought about what he was defending and why it had come to feel, somewhere in 3 weeks of mended fences and shared suppers and creek stones on a windowsill, like a thing worth defending entirely. It was Cole who rode to see Judge Elias Crane in Silas Creek, because it was Cole who had seen Price's face and could name him under oath, but it was Amos Grier who went with him, unasked. Arriving at the Holt place one morning on his mule and saying simply, heard there was trouble, and falling in beside Cole without further discussion. Which was how certain men in that country demonstrated what they were. Judge Crane was a spare, grey-haired man who had been administering law in Kerr County since before most of the people in it had been born. He listened to Cole's account of the Tuesday night with the precision of a man who wasted nothing, no unnecessary questions, no performative skepticism, just the clean reception of facts. When Cole finished, Crane made a note. "Lowell Price," the judge said. "I know that name. He's been on the margin of 2 other matters in this county." He set his pen down. "What I can do with a trespass at night is limited unless we catch him in a more direct act. What concerns me more is what Dent Holt may be building toward." He looked at Cole. "Do you know what basis he might use to challenge the deed?" "Abandonment of property," Cole said. "He'd need to argue it's been neglected to the point of loss." Crane looked at him sharply. "You've thought this through." "I've seen it done before," Cole said. "In Kansas. A man let his brother's widow's property fall to ruin, denied her access to credit, scared off anyone who offered to work it, and then brought a claim that it had been abandoned." Crane tapped the desk. "The property isn't in ruin." "No," Cole said. "It isn't. Not anymore." He paused. "I'd like to make sure it can't be argued either way." He laid out what he had in mind, and Crane listened, and Amos Grier, who had been silent in the corner, made one brief nod. It was Grier who brought it to Clara, because Cole understood that it needed to come from a known man rather than from him, that there was a way these things worked. A dignity to how they needed to be presented, and he respected that. Grier sat with Clara at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening while the children were in bed and Cole was on the bunkhouse step giving them the room, and he laid out the proposal plainly. "The judge believes the best protection for the deed and the children's inheritance is a legal partnership in the property," Grier said. "A registered arrangement that puts Cole Draven's name on the land management in an official capacity. Makes it clear the property is actively maintained and defended." He folded his hands. "Or a marriage of record, which would settle the matter more completely." Clara was quiet for a long while. Grier, who was a wise man, did not fill the silence. "A partnership," she said finally. "You said partnership first." "I did," Grier said. "What does Draven say?" "He said he'd do whatever you decide is right," Grier said. "He also said," and here a small, private smile appeared briefly in the old man's weathered face, "that if it was the other option, he wouldn't have to duel anyone for you. So it would save him considerable inconvenience." Clara looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, something that was not quite a smile and was more than one was moving at the corner of her mouth. "Tell him," she said carefully, "that he's not as funny as he thinks he is." Grier said he would. The word went around Silas Creek with the speed that important words travel in small places. The Holt property had been legally registered under a formal working partnership, Cole Draven named as co-manager of record, the deed itself unassailable. The children's inheritance protected from any claim of abandonment or mismanagement. Judge Crane had reviewed the property records himself and found them immaculate, the improvements documented, the taxes current, the operation demonstrably sound. Harriet Goss had opinions about the arrangement that she expressed to anyone who remained still long enough to receive them. She found fewer people remaining still. Even her husband, Arnold Goss, told her one Sunday morning that a widow woman protecting her children's land was not the subject he wished to discuss before church. And that was something of an occasion in the Goss household. Amos Grier posted a notice on the livery board, a simple notice, handwritten, stating that the Holt property was under active management and that all inquiries regarding its operation should be directed to Mrs. Clara Holt or her partner Cole Draven. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Dent Holt, when the news reached him in Carrow Wells, went very quiet. He sat in Callahan's saloon and he thought about a legal challenge, and then he thought about Judge Elias Crane's reputation, and then he thought about Lowell Price, who had cost him money and accomplished nothing except alerting the other side that he was moving. He thought about all of this for several days. Then he got on his horse and rode south toward San Antonio, where he had other interests and where 140 acres of somebody else's grief were not worth what they were going to cost him. Nobody in Silas Creek marked his leaving. Not formally. But Amos Grier took it as a sign that the barometric pressure of things had improved, and he said so to Cole one afternoon at the feed merchant, and Cole said he agreed. It was a few days after that when Clara came out to the pasture where Cole was working the south gate post, a clear autumn afternoon, the sky scrubbed blue and enormous. The heat finally easing toward something a person could stand. She came across the dry grass and stood a few feet away and watched him work for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. He kept working. "All right. When Thomas died," she said, "I decided I wouldn't need anything from anyone. I decided the children and I would manage entirely alone, and that anyone who tried to help was either after something or pitying me. And I didn't want either." He set down the post driver and looked at her. "I was wrong about some of that," she said. It cost her something to say it. He could see the cost clearly and he honored it. "You weren't wrong to be careful," he said. "No," she said. "But I was wrong about you." He said, "Clara, I'm not finished," she said, and there was the faintest edge of that half smile at the corner of her mouth again. "I was going to say that you have been," she paused, selecting the word with care. "Steady. You have been steady, and I am not accustomed to that, and I did not know what to do with it for a while." He waited. "I still don't know entirely," she said honestly. "I'm still a widow, and that is a real thing, and it doesn't vanish because the fence is mended." "I know that," he said quietly. "But I think," she said, and she looked out at the pasture and the long blue line of the hills beyond it, "that this place could grow back. The way a grazed field grows back if you give it enough time and enough care. I think it could." He looked at the same hills she was looking at. "It's already started," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "May is convinced you left those creek stones on your windowsill because she put them there." "She's right," he said. "She has 17 of them lined up on the bunkhouse sill now," Clara said. "I hope you know that's a formal adoption in her view." He laughed. It came out full and real, and it surprised him slightly, the completeness of it, the ease. Clara looked at him when he laughed, and what was in her face then was something she didn't cover quickly enough, and neither of them spoke about it, because they didn't need to yet. There was time. There was, for the first time in a long time, a sense of time existing not as something to be endured but as something that held possibility in it. She started back toward the house. "Supper's at 6, she said, over her shoulder. "I'll wash up," he said. He watched her walk back across the pasture, her work skirt dark against the dry gold of the grass, the hills behind her going amber in the slanting light. And he thought of what she'd said about a grazed field and how it grows back, and he thought that was exactly right, and that the growing back was its own kind of grace. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ride in fast and fire a gun and ride away again. It shows up in the dark with a hammer and does the work that was left undone. It sits at a table and eats what's offered and asks nothing. It stands in the night with a rifle not because it wants to be a hero but because the thing worth protecting is right there inside that lamplit window, and it needs protecting. And there is no one else. Clara Holt rebuilt her life the way she repaired her roof, one shingle at a time, steady in the heat, not asking for applause. And the land responded the way land does to good tending, it came back. The fence held. The pasture deepened. The children grew into something sturdier than grief. Cole Draven had been looking for somewhere quieter, and he found it, not quiet in the way of emptiness, but quiet in the way of a place that has found its footing. The kind of quiet that is full of small sounds, a hammer working in the morning, a child's voice in the yard, a cast iron pot over a good fire. Two people on a porch saying nothing particular and meaning everything. The creek stone stayed on the windowsill all winter. In the spring, there were 23 of them. And the broken places, the splintered posts, the collapsed faith, the long hollow where grief had carved itself a home, those places grew back. As all broken places do when they are given what they need, time, and work, and someone willing to stay.